So I'd like to open this up. I'll just be moderator for a second, but I'd like to open it up and just ask the panelists one at a time, very quickly. If you were king of the universe, if you could design a system that would get us off of this trajectory, not only of the population growth, which is a huge one, but one policy decision that you would make in Washington, if you were to talk to the secretaries of energy or the president, and you were to design one critical transformational policy, what would you do? Let's start with Frank Napolitano.
Sure. So there's, if we're talking about influencing carbon utilization, just to be narrow, the tax code that I mentioned in my remarks as it related to renewables is also extremely interlaced with the natural gas industry. So there's a financial vehicle called Master Limited Partnerships, which means that, in effect, that the company doesn't have to pay taxes at its level. It flows through its profits to you as individual investors, and you pay the tax on that profit at your level. And that's an extremely efficient financing tool and has been very effective in the outcome, which is building natural gas pipelines, natural gas storage, things to move the physical commodity. So as we look at macroeconomic policy and tax receipts, you can't talk about energy without talking about tax and therefore about budgets. So that's what I would talk about.
Thank you.
Price carbon and the other greenhouse gases, energy externalities, that's regressive, so you adjust the tax code because you would then reduce taxes on income growth related, because now you have a revenue stream from a different set. If the US could get that right, hopefully that may push the international community, but I don't know.
Carbon price, I agree. But definitive and bold, let me say $100 a ton of CO2 is ramping up in 10 years at $10 a ton per year increase. Presented convincingly enough because there's a 97-3 vote in Senate that it's not going to go away, so that industry begins to invest. Large enforcement budget, so you catch it even when just after it comes out of the ground. You don't play around with just the industrial customers, but you go after every carbon atom in the country, and with a lot of buy-in that you achieve at the same time from the rest of the world, so that you're not doing it all by yourself. That's all.
And then lunch.
I mean, I guess I would, of course, jump on the carbon pricing bandwagon, but I think Rob's answer sort of points to why I'm not sure the question is posed as usefully as possible, because of course that's not going to happen. And so I would actually back up and look at the system and try to think about why is that not happening. And I think there's many reasons, but one of which Rob hit on, I think on the head of the nail with his Destiny Studies slide, talking about how we get perspectives that go beyond the next quarterly report or maybe the next election cycle into how we think at a policy level, at a business level, and also as a society. So if I were to wave my wand, somehow we would be able to get out of the sort of short-termism that drives a lot of our decisions now, from which a number of these things might naturally flow.
In favor of 29th best. I'm sure you heard this after. I like that phrase. We have to settle for 29th best, and it does have a carbon price, even so.
Okay, so let's open this up.
A lot of people want it at this point.
Let's open this up to the audience and take some questions. I'd like to ask the students to engage. So graduate students, undergraduate students, you get first dibs. Students, you're all comfortable? Yeah, great. We're going to give you a microphone. Hold on.
Say your name when you get it.
Hi, my name is Dante Lavari. I was wondering, we always talk about reducing carbon emissions and all that. What if today we were to eliminate all further emissions? Do you think global warming would continue to happen, or would it cease eventually?
We have an expert in the room. Tony, how much is built into the cake?
So I think our bet, is this on?
Say your name. Say your name.
I'm Tony Broccoli from the Department of Environmental Sciences. And the answer to the question is that even if emissions were to stop today, there would still be some additional warming because the Earth's temperature is not currently in equilibrium with the amount of
Thank you, Tony. Any other questions from students? More? Great.
It is working.
Intermittently.
I'm Alex Pelham-Webb. Oh, jeez. Oh gosh, I forget your name. You were talking about death spiral and electricity rates.
Frank,
Frank.
good to meet you.
There's two Franks, that's why I get confused. Okay.
The other Frank.
So one of the big, a big point, actually, Rob's point as well, was smart grids and getting to smart grids. And it kind of seemed as if, for the two of you, things would just go that way, that was just the natural thing for the market to do. But it's still a fixed cost. There's still significant investment that needs to be done. Like for Texas, for example, getting over that 20% wind hurdle required quite a bit of investment in that smart grid technology. And if that's something that's directly affects generators, dirtier generators, coal, et cetera, who are still the predominant players in that game, how do you incent the industry to invest in that sort of technology?
That's actually a really tough question, because the smart grid stuff is on the regulated side, transmission and distribution, smart meters, better information technology. There's a whole switching gear, a whole series of issues. And on the generation side in the US, there are two markets, but there's basically a market, roughly stated. So that's a difficult question, and I think it goes to the heart of, do we invest in smart meters so we can do spot pricing and to manage, because storage isn't economical yet, or at least on large scale. But at the same time, that may risk stranded investments, because if it turns out storage does come in combined with, let's say, PV, someone, as the gentleman earlier said, maybe people will leave the grid. So I don't have a good answer. I think that's, and this is we're in the world of this 29th best, and how do you make decisions? What's nice about the United States is there are 50 states, so states will go different ways, and we can, either states can become a leader, like in New Jersey with solar, or at the same time watch what other states do and avoid their mistakes. So it's a tough question. It's a well-poised question, I think.
Any other thoughts from anybody else on the panel?
Sure. On smart grids, I think the industry itself would say they did a poor job of articulating what is a smart grid, what are the benefits of it, and why it should matter to people at the people level. And I think many of those questions still remain unanswered. So currently, it looks like it costs money, it provides information, but it doesn't necessarily then do that next thing. So if it's going to all come together, it has to actually prove to do something of benefit. And if the something is to manage scarcity in a transition of fuel types, then in effect you're asking somebody to tell other people what they can't do based on the information that they're getting, and that's not a very palatable message.
If I could just chime in, it's been a little time since I worked on this stuff, but I think that there is an important distinction in smart grid to be made between smart metering and the consumer-facing stuff, and I think what's actually probably more important with the grid is the things that are actually on the grid and allow you to synchronize generate power sources that are coming at different frequencies. So the stuff needed for the renewable integration in the umbrella of smart grid isn't, it certainly would be supported by some of the things that allow you to turn off people's air conditioners at certain times of day, but those are somewhat separate problems. And when I was at the Department of Energy, we were working on a number of international things around smart grid. And for instance, India was working on deploying phasers to work on grid synchronization, which is part of smart grid, even though consumer side stuff is not really an important issue there.
Any other students or graduate students want to ask a question now?
As China recently surpassed the United States as the leading greenhouse gas emitter, what do you think can be done or will be done in the future about global control of greenhouse gas emissions with the growing middle class in China, as well as India growing as well?
It'd be nice if there were a China expert in the room and he or she would identify himself or herself. But if China is concerned about climate change, I mean, that's obviously, China's a country and there's a billion people there, but if leadership isn't concerned about climate change, it'll do a lot of stuff and it won't wait for us to do it. This is not an imitator. And it is doing some things, whether it's going to be ahead of us in deploying low-to-carbon technology. Here and there, it's got carbon markets being tried out in several cities right now. more than we're doing. Well, California is our ante. I mean, it'd be nice if there were a rivalry to deal with climate change. It's not impossible. I think the idea that only America cares or only American Europe cares needs to be put aside. It's just not what's going on out there now.
And
Do you agree?
yeah, if I could chime in with my inexpert opinion on China. So there's two issues. One, I think we are starting to see in China, sort of is getting an environmental regulation sides back where sort of the West was in the 1950s, where people are dying in large numbers from local air pollutants, which is spurring a lot of environmental movement within the country. And of course, that's happening in the context of global climate. So how those two relate, I think, is up in the air. I do sort of want to challenge a bit the question as it regards to India, because India is still a very different situation than China. China, is still, has a GDP per capita, I believe, around $3,000. It's definitely getting into a middle-income country. About a third of people in India still don't have electric power provided by the grid. And if you look at projections, it's later in the century, the second half of the century, where India is really, what their emissions do, are really a significant contributor to the global stage. We're at a very different point with respect to China than we are with respect to India. And I think when we look at India and at lower income countries, sort of you're in a different point from an equity perspective is where we should be thinking about this problem.
But in both cases, they're building cities at an incredible rate and building infrastructure of all kinds, and this is a time which shouldn't be missed.
And I think particularly in China, whether they're going to build out and look like Los Angeles or look like New York City in terms of their sort of energy intensity and transportation and land use is an important question. Frank, do you?
Are there any other questions from students? Okay. Anji, over here.
There's 3 or 4.
Hello, my name is Will Paxton. I'm a graduate student here. I was just wondering, besides technological and policy changes, what cultural shifts do you all think are necessary in dealing with climate change, both in the United States and globally? Thank you.
Cultural shifts.
I didn't quite get the question.
Well, cultural shifts is not defined. You want to define cultural shifts a bit?
It's moving them from the upper right to the
Sure,
lower left.
cultural shifts like what we consider is necessary in terms of our energy usage, or we consume a lot of energy for convenience things that a lot of the other parts of the world admire and aspire to. And I'm just thinking maybe, is any of this fitting into the equation for actually solving climate change issues?
Yeah, I think there's a good argument that that's where the emphasis should be, because without those shifts, the Congressman Holt referenced this with gay marriage. Without those cultural shifts, they don't then ripple down the system. So you'll recall from the class we had together, if you have Professor Smalls at MIT has this great visual model diagram of the energy system, basically technology, markets, and then social systems at the top. And you could argue a better mousetrap, carbon capture sequestration, that's a bottom-up through technology or so forth. Or we just need to change the culture, to change the politics, to change the markets, to change the technology. So I think that's a really interesting question. What's the best way? And perhaps it's just we have to do both, from the technology and engineering, but also from the cultural piece.
All right.
So a generation really does define its culture, and there are a lot of assumptions being made that the current generation will define the good life more or less as we have. Experience intensive, see every country you can, and every famous work of art, and on and on. This is one way to have a happy life. It's the one that's been dominating. It seems to be dominating as the developing country leaders, elites get to know the world and have options as well. This problem is a problem of prosperity, and if a different kind of prosperity could make a difference. I think it's going to be fascinating to see if that does actually emerge from the conversations that come to terms with the fact that we're not fitting on the planet at the present time.
Thank you. Now let's have two last questions, and these will be from anybody in the general audience.
There were a couple of students who still had questions.
There's still you still have a student? Oh, okay, good.
Tough on them. That's not a
No, there's a student over in the back. Students gets priority.
So a lot of the talk so far has been about mitigation, but in terms of adaptation to the effects of climate change, what kind of implications would that have economically and on energy use?
Great question.
Frank,
Rob?
Frank, do you want to?
Adaptation.
Right, so I think just pick New Jersey is facing this choice without a meaningful federal policy and meaningful international policy. You know, should the state, you talked about trade-offs, should the state spend $1 on adaptation or mitigation? And that's a very tough question. So I think that underscores just the need and the difficulty, unfortunately, of getting a national and international climate policy. Because adaptation is local in the sense that people will experience the harm however, and therefore I think the politics will respond to that. It's the mitigation, and it may be unfortunate we spend more money on adaptation than we need to because we don't mitigate, but that may be the situation we're in, and then I guess there we are. I start hoping that it's not as bad as we think it could be.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to chime in that I think the sort of thinking we need to deal with these problems has a fair bit of similarity. Some adaptation is a relatively quick response, but on the other hand, if you look at, well, why were we without power in many parts of the state for 2 weeks after Sandy? Well, many of the switching stations that flooded, you could identify on a map of the New Jersey electric grid in the first decade of the 20th century, right? So those were 100-year infrastructure siting decisions. The infrastructure had been replaced, but the siting decisions were embedded in sort of how we built land use sector, how we built our networks. And so in many cases, we need that sort of long-term thinking for robust adaptation as well.
Let me add the international component. Much of the damage from climate change, much of the suffering will be in the developing world, in the poorest parts of the developing world. And so you get this question, are you going to spend money that's specifically on adaptation, or does general development, insurance systems, education, warning systems, all the kinds of things that will make consequences less severe are part of development as well. It's a tweaking of a development process. But so it gets back to really providing, encouraging, and facilitating the aid that enables development, the policies that enable development in the developing world, and the leverage, to the extent that we have any from the U.S., is significant.
I just want one comment in the financial world on the question of adaptation. There is people voting with their feet. So in effect, those who are burdened with the prosperity problem are moving to places where they can retain more of that prosperity. And that's changing the dynamics of utilization. So for example, the northeastern blue states are seeing a population exodus in favor of the South and Texas. And right now there's sort of a commercial battle within corporate America between the states of California and Texas, where Texas is inviting California corporations to come and reincorporate in Texas under the thesis of a more stable economy, a more stable energy climate. They have a lot more control of their natural resources in that state because they dictate what they do in that state. That's their policy. And a more favorable tax plan. There's no property taxes, there's no estate taxes, et cetera. So this will play out on a local level, as Frank mentioned, for the rest of our lifetimes.
I think the next energy symposium will be devoting to a lot about adaptation and climate change and the energy responsibilities. It's a very good theme, actually. We have a lot of people on sea level, a lot of people that work on a lot of things related to infrastructure. Let me ask for the last two questions before we give our energy prizes away. Yes, Alfred.
Thank you. My name is Albert Ayeni from the School of Environmental and Biological Sciences. Sub-Saharan Africa is very, very energy deficient, power short, and they are running to see what options they have to increase power for social use, for domestic use, and for industrial development. Which of the options do you think should be emphasized in that part of the world? Is it renewable, or coal, or fossil, or what options would you suggest?
That's a difficult problem.
All
Anybody?
right. So I mean, I think it's a tricky question, and it
Not a
plays in-
tricky question, it's a very good question.
Yeah, but I mean, to some extent, it plays into the point that Rob was making about development, right? There's an argument to be made that if you're developing quickly, the benefits of they're at some threshold, right? People have a right to energy, and below a certain threshold, you could argue maybe coal is not that big a problem. But I think the challenge is, right, you're building infrastructure that could be around for 60 years. Hopefully, within that time period, Africa will be much wealthier than it is today. And so, to the extent that there are opportunities to leapfrog the West in sort of how we build out our electricity system at a reasonable price point, I think we would take it. So one example, microgrids, right? That could be very well suited for places where the transportation network isn't that well developed, and that leads to a lot of disconnection. When I was at DOE, we were working on a program called Global Leap with the International Finance Corporation to sort of promote quality assured markets in solar lighting systems and solar home energy systems. And so that's one thing that's could well be, right now on the lighting side, that's a very small scale, but kerosene lighting is very common in Africa, and compared to solar lanterns, they're not cost effective over the long term. The problem is that the initial capital cost of a solar lantern system is 6 months of income. But I mean, I think there are a lot of opportunities to leapfrog and not get mired in having the 60 or 80-year-old infrastructure 80 years down the road that is not compatible with a stable climate.
Let me add, I think maybe a way to get the question into some kind of control is to think about two Africas. The really poor people in the villages, or the favelas equivalent, who do not have access to modern energy carriers. I think it's not necessary to ask that the very first stages of emergence from poverty be low carbon. Diesel engines and buses and cooking fuels that are fossil energy, where they are cheaper and more convenient, should just be brought to the very poorest people. They do not have to solve the climate problem. It doesn't add up when they do a very large amount of compensation if they do have fossil energy. When you start building cities for the middle class and apartment buildings and appliances in those apartment buildings and bus systems and highways and so on, that's when you really can have, this is where leapfrogging comes in. Do it completely differently from the models of the past, with low carbon and sustainability in mind, because that's where the rest of the world's going to get to, but get it right the first time. I think it's two different models for two different parts of the problem.
Okay, thank you. Last question. Going once. Going twice. You got it.
Hi. So I think the million-dollar question here is consumer price, like consumer expectation of the price of energy. Because at the end of the day, like I think Frank said, we're all consumers of energy here, and we're all looking at our bills and making decisions off of our own pocketbook. So along with the cultural and societal changes, how do you think that to move people towards expecting a higher price of energy just to pay for all of the new and beneficial ways that we view, that we can create energy?
Yeah, we can't add a little bit more to our gas tanks in the state of New Jersey. No governor has done it in years, so it's an interesting problem. Anybody going to take a shot at that? Frank?
I would blame ourselves. I mean, you can't blame a politician who runs for office if raising energy prices is the third rail of politics. In Connecticut, a very progressive liberal state, the current governor, I believe, ran on lowering electricity prices. And unless you get all those various subsidies and incentives right, which I think is difficult, I think we come back to, as my talk kind of indicated, at least my view, we got a price card, which means higher electricity, energy prices, not just electricity. But that's why if you can offset it with tax reform, and then address the equity issues, which are so important as well. But that's like saying, let's all be nice to each other at lunch. I mean, it's just very common.
We could all say, let's all be like the Danes or something, right?
But that we have done so many things that make our society one we're proud of, that have raised the costs. I stayed in a hotel last night. It has all kinds of features that enable people with disabilities to get around. That's in the price of that hotel room somewhere. And we have cleaner air, and that's in the price of power. And we have safe appliances, and that's in the price of the appliances. So we do pay for externalities when we give a damn about them, and we do it in indirect ways so that we don't vote people out of office when they get it done. And I'm sure we can figure this one out.
I do want to emphasize what I think what Frank was saying about the potential for coupling this as part of sort of broader tax reform and distributional questions. British Columbia is the example in North America that has a successful carbon tax, and the revenue from that basically is recycled into two things. One is some assistance for low-income people who have more higher energy bills, and the other is lower taxes on labor, lower payroll taxes. You know, we could imagine doing something similar in New Jersey, where the revenues partly go to pay for property tax refunds, which I'm sure all of us who own property in New Jersey would like to see lower levels of.
And New Jersey did that when it was in Regium Park. The money was recycled for energy efficiency, which of course would lower your bill. But so yeah, I think there's so.
So I mentioned a class of companies in my remarks called competitive retailers. Those are the folks you actually buy the power commodity from, different than the utility who delivers it. And there were specialty retailers at the emergence of that business line who were just renewable power providers. And they found a market. Folks who wanted to pay more for that power because they believed in everything that went with it did pay for it. Now, many of those companies then got merged into broader companies that offered power as opposed to renewable power. And when those very same renewable power folks saw the comparison in price between regular power or brown power and renewable power, some of them continued to pay for the renewable power, but when the recession hit, more of them went for the brown power.
Okay, I want to thank our distinguished speakers from this morning. They gave great talks. Thank you very much.